All right, why don't we start it popping? Hi everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your Thursday to join us in this webinar on abolitionist universities organizing in and against higher education. I'm Nick Mitchell. I work at UC Santa Cruz, and I'm a member of the UC Cops Off Campus Coalition and the Cops Off Campus Research Project. Let me also shout out my comrades and co-organizers, Erica Miners, Dylan Rodriguez, and Setsu Shigematsu for all of their work in making this happen. This is the third and the last of three webinars on universities and abolition that we've organized this fall. UC Santa Cruz, where I work, its operational base is on the unceded territory of the Awaswa-speaking UP tribe. Today, the Amamutsan tribal band includes the descendants of those indigenous people who, through genocidal technologies of displacement, capture, and accumulation, were taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista. The Amamutsan continue to struggle to restore stewardship practices on the lands the university claims. In the 19th century, the University of California's inaugural land-grant campus offered the institutional ballast to support settler accumulation. Before UC Santa Cruz was founded, the land on which it ultimately settled was the object of those settler ambitions. The Cowell Ranch, the name borne by the land on which the campus was settled, first had its limestone quarries extracted by mining projects. Later, the fields adjacent to those quarries were repurposed to collect, raise, and breed livestock. Today, schooling on the land extends the extractive project toward different ends. You can spend a long time on the UC Santa Cruz campus without setting eyes on the police that the campus spends over $5 million on each year. And this is in many ways by design. UC Santa Cruz was made in order to have nature overwhelm the sense of being in the presence of the state. And so thinking about the relationship between UC Santa Cruz and policing has been sometimes difficult, at least until the past year, where the wildcat strike by UC Santa Cruz graduate students actually set many people's eyes on the ways in which policing converged on a campus in which graduate students were fighting to win a living wage. And so UC Santa Cruz has been a really interesting site to kind of think about the convergence of universities and policing in many different ways. And so I'm hoping that this also offers a way of actually moving into those conversations about the convergence of university policing and fights and struggles to create a university that's a more of a liberationist institution. And so I'm hoping our panelists can help us think through some of those problems. We've got people who are experienced organizers, people who have done work in various university contexts in order to shepherd resources toward building abolitionist infrastructures, and I'm excited to start the conversation with them. So what I'll do first is introduce our panelists, and then I have a couple of questions. I have questions for every panelist that we'll go through. I've asked them to speak initially for 5 to 7 minutes, and after that we can actually open the floor up for Q&A. So let me start out by introducing Audrey Beard. Audrey is a researcher and software engineer living in Brooklyn. They've worked with students at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and the City University of New York to collect, analyze, and organize around data about campus policing. Audrey joined the Cops Off Campus Research Project in June. Second, we've got Blue Buchanan. Blue Buchanan is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of California, Davis. Their research explores white gay men's participation in right-wing social movements. Then we've got Yulia Gilic. Yulia is a media artist, scholar, and community organizer. They are a PhD candidate in the Department of Film and Digital Media at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Uh-oh, I just doubled myself. Their work is primarily concerned with the use of settler colonization in larger imperial projects, particularly those of the United States and Israel. Then Sandy Grande. Sandy is a professor of political science and Native American and Indigenous studies at the University of Connecticut with affiliations in American Studies, Philosophy, and the Race, Ethnicity, and Politics program. Her research and teaching interfaces Native American and Indigenous studies with critical theory toward the development of more nuanced systems or nuanced analyses of the colonial present. She was recently awarded the Ford Foundation Senior Fellowship for a project on Indigenous elders and aging. In addition to her academic and organizing work, she's provided elder care for her parents for over 10 years and remains the primary caregiver for her 92-year-old father. And last but not least is Damien Sojourner, who is an associate professor of anthropology at UC Irvine and board member of the Southern California Library. He works on the relationship between schools and prisons in California. And so if my computer will work, which it doesn't seem to be doing, I will start with the questions that I have for folks. This is life now. I had a particularly difficult time getting my computer to behave this morning, but luckily I've got a backup. Okay, so we'll start with Sandy. So Sandy, you've written in your essay, Refusing the University, about how engaging the university, in your words, as an arm of the settler state, opens up more possibilities for coalition and collusion within and outside the university. And what seems especially important to that is that you pair the diagnosis of the university as an active and not a passive feature of settler colonialism with an insistence on three commitments: collectivity, reciprocity, and mutuality in building a specifically decolonial form of abolition and an abolitionist relationship to decolonization. The way that you work through the process of building interconnected movements between abolition and decoloniality is by thinking through relationships, and relationships not so much as abstract formations, but as relationships between people. And you talk about refusal there, not only abstractly, but also as actually giving up some things, leaving things behind in order to make decolonial space and time possible. So in light of the uprisings and transits in the past year, are you thinking differently or newly about the relationships that need to be built or the refusals that are urgent to enact in and outside of the university? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you, Nick, and lovely to be here with everybody in Critical Resistance, and just want to recognize the work that all of you do, and just, you know, every day we hit the ground running, so I appreciate all the labors that go into that. Let me backtrack a little bit. Ayanchu Inostare Sweetie Sandy Grande, coming at you from, I'm in Manhattan, which is Lenape territory. And Nick, in light of like, these are the times we're in. So I am a little bit double booked, so I want to apologize ahead of time that to jump off a few minutes early from this, I failed to account for the time difference. So double book myself in any case. But great question to get us started off on. And absolutely, I think a lot of the work that in terms of how I think about the university, the Settler University in particular, and maybe the efforts to for abolition and decolonization of the university, I do ground my thinking in the notion of relationality as it emerges within Indigenous context. And so while that's related to the idea of building relationships, the notion of relationality, I think, is a bit broader than that. I think of it more of it as an ethic rooted primarily in our fundamental relationship to land. And in addition to sort of the material context, and for the university, that means, you know, per your wonderful intro, that universities are built in many cases on stolen land, on misappropriated land. So it's sort of the materiality of that, but it's also land as a relation. And land as a relation that conditions all our other relations. And in that sense, I think of it as a competing moral universe, I guess, to one built upon the transactions, extractions, and accumulations of capital and property. So at root in that, to me, is not the questions of what can be individually gained or appropriated or owned or elevated, but it's about our collective obligations to the whole. So in light of the current, I guess, uprisings and transits, as you say, which includes the world literally being on fire as we speak, it's just you know, deepening that we absolute urgency, I guess, around building upon the notion of relationality as opposed to the kind of extractivist ethics of capital. And I guess that also calls into question the ways in which universities and settler institutions, of which universities are included, often build around the promised projects of inclusion, I think, that and equity that feeds both settler and capitalist imperatives. So I think similarly, refusal, like abolition, is a generative space. It's not just about rejecting or dismantling oppressive systems, though that's a part of it. It's more of a recognition that in order for us to live, to sort of paraphrase Glenn Coulthard's notion that for Indigenous peoples to live, capitalism must die. It's the systems that uphold that must die. And that includes a consideration that the university as we know it, the university as such, is a system that might need to die. And insofar as education in general is built upon, settler education is built upon carceral logics that then lead to all the other issues central to abolitionist movements, all of it, I think we need to be in the process of refusing and reconsidering.
Thanks, Sandy. One of the things I didn't mention in my introduction is that because of the quarry mining that UC Santa Cruz is built on, and this is something that I know because of research that Sophie Lev did in my Marxism and Feminism seminar last year, that UC Santa Cruz is quite literally undermined by its own settler history. And so buildings are always in the threat of actually becoming sinkholes. And so there's a kind of very literal way in which its own settler history undermines the institution. And I think thinking about different relationships to the land itself might be one way of opening up the question of what kind of death do we want the university to die, if that's a possibility of thinking through it. So thanks so much. So along with different kinds of relationships, we also need new tools. And Audrey, you've been working over the past half a year or so to develop a set of tools for studying campus policing. Can you tell us about what the Cops Off Campus database is and what it does, and a little bit about the research project?
This is Audrey. Yeah, thanks, Nick. The Cops Off Campus database is an integral part of the Cops Off Campus research project, which is an effort to make studyable and then study the ties between colleges or universities and policing. The project includes the database, toolkits for framing the project within a larger abolitionist movement, and tutorials for learning how to study individual universities. The database itself is a crowdsourced and heterogeneous collection of qualitative and quantitative data about university police relationships. So we're soliciting testimonials, institutional documents, budget data, student and locale demographics, news articles, and scholarship about these sorts of relationships. Now, when we talk about policing and universities, we're not just referring to public safety officers or local police departments. From mandatory reporting to surveillance COVID protocols to on-campus housing RAs, the practices of policing are really deeply entrenched in every aspect of the Academy's day-to-day operations. So we see that these roots run very deep and are deeply embedded in not only the institutions, but also the technologies that make these institutions function. And that's something that the Coalition for Critical Technology has explored a little bit as well. Now, the Cops Off Campus Research Project, recognize that some of the data that we're asking for is readily available through automatic web scraping. But ultimately, the efficiency of our data collection isn't really the goal. Just as important as the data that we get is the process, the sharing of knowledge, the capacity building, and formation of university-focused abolitionist networks across the US. So ultimately, we hope that the project, A, renders visible more aspects of campus policing, but B, also facilitates abolitionist struggles in every school, college, and university in the US.
Amazing, thank you, Audrey. The Cops Off Campus slogan is, for many people, relatively new. And we haven't necessarily had the kind of conversation that might be generative with a lot of people who've done work on the question of the relationship of policing and carcerality to schooling more broadly. So I'm really glad that we've got Damien here, because Damien's done a lot of really incredible critical scholarship, both on the question of the school to prison pipeline, but also really pushing us to think beyond school to prison pipeline as a concept. And one of the things that you do, Damien, in your book First Strike is actually to kind of push against the fantasy about education that can get enlivened in the critique of the school to prison pipeline, as though it were prison were something that were against the logic of education, completely anathema to the logic of education, and really encouraging us to think more robustly about how education itself has historically been a major site of oppression, antagonism, anti-Black violence, and it's the ways in which those systems reproduce themselves over time. And I think that helps us get to one of the tensions that we run into in doing Cops Off Campus work, because sometimes it can sound when we're using the slogan "Cops Off Campus" as though we're being exceptionalizing, as though we were kind of making peace with cops being elsewhere, and as though we think that cops are wrong because they're on campus, because campus should be free from policing, and so there's a paradox there. The Cops Off Campus idea for many of us doing or organizing in the UC Cops Off Campus Coalition project was rooted in an idea that there's an opportunity now to fight policing that we might not have next year. And so we wanted to focus on the university in this way, but we also, we run into the problem of exceptionalizing. So as someone who's done a lot of scholarship on the intersection of those kind of questions, I'm just wondering if you have any strategic thoughts or thoughts about how to navigate that set of contradictions.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for all the organizers for your diligent and hard work. I know being in the middle of a pandemic, there's 1,000 things going on. And so trying to juggle all those things at the same time can be very perilous. So thank you first and foremost. Thank you, Nick, for the wonderful question. I appreciate that. I think it was a good distillation of what I've been trying to sort of wrestle with over these past few years. And with regard to the general conversation with respect to carcerality, the carceral state, and education, I think there's been a lot of work that's been done, great work actually, in both spaces. And so part of my sort of goal is to bridge that work together into a conversation where people sort of can bring these wonderful ideas and have further discussions about them. I think, to answer your question is to build off of Audrey's points, which is in particular looking at the ways in which when we think about carcerality in the carceral space, how in some capacity, when we say education or school actually laid the groundwork for carcerality in of itself. So when you think about the foundations of, for example, Black education, which come post Reconstruction, then we're talking about the models that were laid out for Indigenous education, which were then built upon that, right? So like the Hampton model, which is based upon the Carlisle model in Pennsylvania, which, as we all know, is about capturing Indigenous bodies and sort of forcing them to become civilized in various ways. And that becomes like the model for the education of Black people. So just the very basis of an educative space in the United States, right? Because the Reconstruction in many ways is the formation of the modern sort of state in which we live, has to be understood as one of capture. And that more than anything else, if we can set that as the groundwork, then we have a whole different conversation with regards to what the function, as you laid out beautifully in the introduction with respect to UC Santa Cruz, what is the function of the university then? What is it intended to do? And that is one where it gets extremely complex with relationship to the notion of cops and policing, because in many ways, the cops and the policing that we associate with sort of like the formal aspects of policing are in fact being done by agents of the state who we don't necessarily think of as being agents of the state, right? But I'm sure all of us can come up with a laundry list of faculty and researchers who are doing more cop-like work than even the formal cops. And in many cases are actually putting the cops into motion based upon their research. So there's whole centers that are generated from university spaces, which set the policy, which then different city agencies use to employ cops into different spaces, which, you know, quite frankly, otherwise wouldn't be the case. So I think it is imperative for us, as we're looking at this relationship between carcerality and education, to also think about the ways in which the folks who we think of as doing like the Lord's work at the university are in fact those very cops themselves, in terms of actual policing work. So that's sort of A. B, there's a little bit of the racial dynamics bring out attention to it, which is that given the complete gutting of any type of social infrastructure, state infrastructure, bottom line, even prior to the pandemic, prior to 07, 08 with the collapse of the housing market, Black people didn't have jobs, right? Like that was pretty obvious. Post 1965, like all of, you know, that's one of the key aspects of the Watts rebellion, is to bring out, you know, to sort of to light as to what's happening for Black people who are migrating into these urban spaces, of what the reality of the situation is. However, the one space where there are jobs is in through the apparatuses of the carceral state, right? So then it can't be by chance then that in many of these sort of spaces of, for example, like the astrophysical cops who are on these campuses are very large, like Black people. This is the same issue that happens on public education spaces, where the school resource officers, by and large, are Black men on these spaces. And it turns out that, you know, they may be one of the handful of Black people that students may see on campus, right? So it's an odd juxtaposition to have to be able to sort of reckon with, that if you're calling for a dismantling of an institution, which I think is a viable call, right? At the same time, we have to realize that this has been the avenue for Black people to sort of make a way out of no way. Now, we all have our critiques of the police, and I think they're very viable, but then we need to put something else in place that's going to be sort of available, because otherwise you're not going to have a base to rally behind. And by and large, just becomes like an organizational strategy that has to be kept in mind as well. And then third, I think it's important to remember that the imbrication of the carceral state has become so ingrained within the university that when we're talking about abolishing carcerality, there's key components of the university they're going to have to be undone. And I think we really have to reckon with that. And I'm all for abolition in a broad scope. And I think it's important upon those people who are making those calls to really think very clearly and concisely about what that means. Because in many cases, that's going to mean completely dismantling whole departments on campuses, which I don't think, you know, like I said, like I'm all for doing the heavy work, the rigorous work of thinking through these things. But it's just, it's a lot to wrestle with, and you have to be very strategic and have to know what it is that you're calling for as a goal, which I think is something that everybody who's on this panel has already sort of, they are doing that work, right? Like they are in sort of quote unquote trenches of thinking about like policy formation, of thinking about where resources are going to be coming from. So I think people are already doing that work. It is more of, I think it's our job to be very crystal clear about what that actually is going to look like and how we can support people thinking through those measures outside of sort of a championing of abolition as just like a catchphrase, which is unfortunately what is happening more or less right now in this current moment. It's sort of become like the hot buzzword without actually thinking, sort of through the particular dynamics of what that means.
Thanks so much, Damien. Yes, so much to work with there. And I just wanted to point out some really important resonances about what you're saying about the need to go beyond diversification discourses and how much there's this resonance between a lot of initiatives toward diversification and turning certain kinds of initiatives to pull historically minoritized populations into higher education as a means of fortifying institutions of policing. And so one of the ways of thinking through abolition is actually thinking about how to make different parts of university education that reinforce policing less capable of doing that. And I think this is a place where I think, Blue, you could probably say a few things, especially because of your work with UAW 2865 on the effort to demilitarize and disarm UCPD. I think it's fascinating as someone who's come through the UC system as a graduate student, how certain questions both get re-enlivened and also fade in the context of graduate student organizing. And the hard thing is to sustain an effort over time, because unlike other sectors of union organizing, graduate student organizing has a population of union members whose relationship to universities is to not be students at some point. And so there's this kind of like built-in discontinuity that makes it so that some struggles that have been historically part of even the same unions that's fighting against the university presently just have this inbuilt discontinuity. So I'd love to hear just about the history of that effort, and yeah, any thoughts you have about having participated in that, about what things look like today.
Yes, awesome. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Nick. So the way that I've sort of organize my talk is to first start with a little bit of a timeline. I really appreciated the points brought up by Damien about like, well, what does actual on the ground organizing look like? Especially in a moment where so often we do tend to use abolition as sort of a buzzword, right? So what does it actually look like on the ground? A little bit of background. I've been doing sort of police disarmament organizing since approximately 2014. I came to the UC system in 2012. I'm still a grad student, so one of those long folks with a good amount of institutional memory. And really, I started doing union organizing first. I really entered into the union with an orientation towards labor, towards anti-capitalism, and with the death of Michael Brown, with the non-indictment of Eric Garner's murder, a number of Black folks who were a part of the union who felt like particularly anti-Blackness, both in the union and in the university at large, weren't being addressed. We formed a group called BIC, the Black Interest Coordinating Committee. This coordinating committee was made up of Black folks from across all of the UC campuses who were academic employees as workers. And one of our main goals right off the bat was in some ways to check the union. We organized in part because of sort of the inbuilt white supremacy that was emerging from within the union, benevolent or not, right? And so people were coming together to write a statement about Eric Garner. There was a lot of fucked up language, and a lot of that we basically corrected. That was our first sort of organizing moment. But by July of 2015, we had worked together to bring the union to the point of creating and issuing a statement to the AFL-CIO. Now, for folks outside of the labor organizing context, the AFL-CIO is the big, giant umbrella labor organization in the United States. And basically what we did was we said, as graduate students, as workers, we are calling for the disaffiliation of the AFL-CIO from all cop associations, all police unions, because we argued that, in fact, those quote unquote police unions were not a part of the labor movement. So this is 6 months after BIC forms. Largely, this call for disaffiliation emerges from UC Davis organizers in conjunction with BIC. And so we issued this statement. It was taken by the AFL-CIO. It was actually a number of Black folks within the AFL-CIO reached out in private to be like, this is so amazing. This is what we've needed in the organization, particularly because the AFL-CIO, with the death of Michael Brown, sort of issued this wishy-washy statement, right? Which said, oh, one union member killed another union member's child. And that's sad. Right. So one of the things that we really wanted to do was reorient the conversation around labor. In terms of organizing here in the UCs, one of the things that we sort of did was we actually built off of the work of other folks. And I just want to give a brief shout out to them and recognize how they played a role in this. UCI's BSU, so UC Irvine's BSU, in 2016 called for the abolition of their police department. So they were one of the first folks sort of at the UC system to do this work. In addition, many of the sort of organizing principles we were acting on were drawn from a movement a little further north of here, the hashtag Disarm PSU movement. That's Portland State University. In 2017, this translated into the inclusion of an abolition and police disarmament question into our bargaining survey. And overwhelmingly, the majority of rank and file folks supported the call for the abolition and disarmament of police across the UC campuses. So then we had to ask ourselves sort of the hard question of, well, what does that actually look like in terms of organizing on the ground? We now have sort of touched base with our rank and file. We know that they're interested in this sort of abolitionist project. What does that mean in terms of getting people out and involved in direct actions? So 2018 turned out to be a big year for that. In May 2nd, UC Davis's Graduate Student Association called for the disarming of campus police. The UC Student Association passed a disarm resolution 2 days later. UAW 2865 unveiled the first ever disarm contract language for a union on June 7th. The SSSP, which is the Society for the Study of Social Problems, called for the disarming of campus police nationwide, and were heavily influenced by organizers from UAW 2865. In the beginning of 2019, UC Santa Barbara also called for the disarming of campus police. And later that May, UC Davis also passed a disarm resolution. And then by June 1st, the California College Democrats also called for the disarming of campus police. So these were some of the beginning things which really sort of culminated in a sort of cross-fertilization with the COLA movement, which Yulia, I hope, I expect will probably be speaking on more. So what prompted the sort of organizing that's happened across California has largely been about the death of community members, and about the tepid relationship and response of labor to BLM at large. And I just want to sort of briefly touch on a few key challenges that we've found to organizing sort of across these various milieus. The first is that the university loves feedback. It loves using feedback as a mechanism of sort of channeling energy away from actual concrete organizing into the sort of administrative project. And this particularly neoliberal aspect of higher education has been a great way of sort of diffusing organizing on the ground. For example, today we just had UAW 2865 just had a joint labor management meeting in which a whole bunch of folks presented on why having cops on campus was a health and safety issue. But they took that and said, you know what? We're going to take it into consideration and we'll get back to you, right? And this is a great way of basically saying, yes, we've heard you, but we're not actually going to do anything about it. One of the other things that has come up consistently, or that I've noticed throughout my history of organizing, is this issue of exceptionalism. And I think that this ties in with what Damien was talking about a little bit before, in that this is true also of Black students on campus, that there's a sense that the university is somehow exceptional and that the people who are a part of it are also exceptional. So even within communities affected by police violence, there's the idea that somehow this is going to be better than the places that we come from. And that's actually been a huge issue, particularly in organizing undergrads who are very heavily invested in the idea that education is their route to liberation, right? And the last part that I want to touch on is austerity and the role that austerity has played both in the UC at large, but also in labor organizing itself. For those of y'all, again, who may not be as versed in labor organizing stuff, the Janus decision that happened in 2018 was a major strike against labor organizing in the United States. Fundamentally, it said that if you were not a full member of a union, but still receive benefits. Remember, previously, if you were covered by a contract, you would pay in just a little bit in order to be covered by the union's work. That was rescinded. That was no longer the case after the Janus decision. This fear of austerity actually heavily influenced unions' turn towards right-wing politics, in which the traditional worker, the common laborer that everyone sort of pictures within the labor movement, was increasingly white, male, and of a particular class and social background. And so the fear was that calls of abolition were going to undermine the union's capacity to continue to exist. And so the union's orientation, its sort of concern about continuing to exist, led it to be heavily involved in a lot of reactionary political organizing. And in fact, despite the fact that in 2018, UAW unveiled this sort of unique first ever disarm language, they never really bargained for it during that year. And in fact, it along with sanctuary demands in our contract were essentially dropped off. They were given up before we ever really bargained for them because they were seen as too contentious and too difficult to mobilize our folks around. So feedback mechanisms, exceptionalism, both within graduate students, undergrads, faculty, as well as austerity, have been sort of the main three issues that we've faced getting abolitionist politics active and going on the ground. And I just want to sort of turn here towards what Damien was talking about, like, well, we need to come up with replacements. this is where I sort of want to encourage us to talk about practicing abolition, so that it's no longer a question of like, well, when are we going to get the university to recognize our abolitionist politics, or to dismantle their own set of power relations, but to really bring it back to the question of how are we practicing abolition now. My work, my scholarly work is on white supremacy. And so one of the things before I finish is just to recognize that that work on white supremacist movements has really provided a entree into understanding how labor organizing and the university in general utilizes white supremacist tactics, and often actually is heavily involved in the sort of funneling of leftist language and the use of leftist language in order to promote the status quo. And so talking about abeyance strategies, right? So white supremacists utilize things like abeyance strategies in which they, when stigma is operating, they tend to change or downplay their language. And they adopt more liberal, nice sounding language. We've seen this, for example, at UC Davis with the promotion of the CHPs. The former California Highway Patrol director is now the chief of our police department. And this was a major strategy on our campus to basically put a nice face on cops, right? They chose a cop of color. They chose a cop who is very well versed in the sort of public relations aspects of policing. And so it's important to recognize that this is actually very similar to the abeyance strategies of like neo-Nazis, right? Where what you do is you sort of push explicit stigma-producing kinds of discourse below the surface in order to essentially wait it out until conditions are ripe again for these white supremacist movements to emerge. So oftentimes, I know many of us are feeling some kind of way after the election cycle, right? Many of the questions that people had over this past decade have been, how did all these white supremacist organizations spring up out of nowhere? Well, they didn't spring up out of nowhere. They were practicing these abeyance strategies. That's the same way with the police. And so when we're talking about the university, we have to be talking about how it's practicing the same strategies and tactics of white supremacist organizations. If we're really going to take seriously and take seriously and understand how actual progress towards abolitionist liberation is going to come about. If we get too caught up in feedback mechanisms, if we get too caught up sort of trying to address the nice face of policing, we will end up really just reinstituting newer, better, kinder faces of right-wing white supremacist politics. And I think that's probably it for me. Thank you.
Lou, thank you. That was phenomenal. And I think just in terms of, abeyance strategies, just to connect 2 points you're talking about, the we hear you, we'll start a coalition, or we'll start a conversation, here's your committee, here's your task force on this problem, is, probably the par excellence abeyance strategy of university administration itself. And I think it's really useful to name it as such. And so thank you for offering us the language that you have in kind of pointing out some of the tactics that get used in these instances. And I think it raises the strategy of counter tactics, because if making demands toward the university in the usual channels doesn't work, how do we respond? And I think that was something that played out with particularly interesting force at UC Santa Cruz. So I want to ask Yulia to talk a little bit more about a couple of things. I mean, the cost of living adjustment strike at UC Santa Cruz shifted tactically, starting from a grading strike and then becoming a full labor stoppage, but also it shifted in ideology. In response to the way that the university responded to the strike. And I think, you tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think that many of the organizers of the Wildcat strike, and Wildcat strike being in an instance when people who are affiliated with the union kind of strike against their employer, but also kind of are striking against their union simultaneously, because they're striking without official approval, at least. But I think a lot of the people who were involved in organizing the Wildcat strike did not necessarily expect it to become a strike against policing in the way that it did. Yet it did, and in many ways, like the language cops off campus that we're using came from the picket lines, came from one of the chants at the picket line. So I'm fascinated to hear, as someone who was involved in that organizing, what it's been like to see this movement between different emphases, but also, are there things getting lost in translation? I'm wondering. Like how do you see that movement playing out? So yeah, anything that you'd like to say on those questions?
Yeah, thank you, Nick, and thanks everyone here. This is so fascinating and like really enriching. And I'm like making connections to the things that I'm saying, so I'm gonna try to articulate them. But yeah, I think I wanna start by saying that cops off campus, cola in my bank account was one of the primary chants of the entire cola movement. And while in our mind, the two demands were connected, at least financially, because whenever people would ask, well, where would living wages come from? We would say, well, let's abolish police and use that money for wages. But I think there was a failure to articulate how these demands are actually intertwined beyond that. And so, particularly among white organizers, the structural engagement with the racial struggle was missing, and COLA was imagined and constructed as labor alone. But I think, Nick, what you were saying, the picket line is precisely what changed that, because hundreds of riot police from day one who appeared on the picket line demonstrated in no uncertain terms the co-constitution of race and labor under racial capitalism. And it became very clear that if you fight the boss, you'll have to fight the police. And the police will always side with the boss, and the boss will persist to police you if you resist your exploitation. So while all of these sort of connections began to emerge, the brunt of policing, as it always does, disproportionately affected our comrades of color who were brutally beaten by the police, surveilled, intimidated, arrested, and then disciplined and suspended by the university administration. The connection that Dylan Rodriguez talks about, right? That there's a that the police and university admin is of the same, is one and the same. Sorry, Dylan, for butchering what you're saying. Yeah, so it became very clear that even having a COLA would not make campus safe for Black and brown students and workers. And we cannot end labor exploitation without ending racial exploitation, which is enforced by the cops. So yeah, I think definitely once we withheld our labor, and went on the picket line, this became very clear. But the picket line also, at least for me, allowed for a glimpse of an abolitionist future in which the $300,000 that we raised in our strike fund were enough to feed thousands of people on the picket line for a month, to house and feed and keep enrolled in school all of the fired graduate student workers. We paid for gas, for legal fees, for medical treatment, rented toilets, posted bail, provided first aid, and the kinds of mutual aid that we built on the picket line persisted through the lockdown. And the irony is that the cost of one day's policing, the $300,000 a day the UCSC paid for extra policing of the picket line, was enough not only to house and feed each other, but keep a huge community safe, and also provide space and care for rest and recovery. And for many of us, for the first time, to be in community with each other. And I think it's precisely that sense of community that on our campus, I think we built across different ranks, but also that we built across the state with other UCs, allowed for a continuity of this organizing. Because faculty from all different UCs who started organizing in solidarity with COLA continued organizing for COPs of campus, right? And then this demand was plugged in back into COLA networks. But the tension and the issue with that, I think that Nick is pointing out, in my mind, is threefold. So one is, what I'm seeing is that many students, and especially white students, got activated by COLA, by the economic demand. And the moment the abolitionist demand was centered, sort of checked out. And I think there is a lot of organizing to be done to bring them back in. The other issue I'm seeing is that coalitional organizing between students and faculty and staff and workers on different campuses is precisely what we need. However, it's unclear to me what shared leverage we all have. And in my mind, it must be labor. And strike is my answer to everything. But I don't know how to organize faculty across different campuses who side with management and who don't think of themselves as workers. So the strategic future of the coalition is unclear to me. And I think the third tension is something that has been mentioned by a few folks today, is the exceptional nature of the demand, but also the way in which COLA, but also COPs of campus, can be read as reformist, as a way to preserve the institution as it exists right now and re-legitimize it. So even abolition of UCPD, which is great and let's do it, right, has that limitation. I'm gonna stop here.
Thank you, Yulia. And I think that a lot of us who were trying to figure out encountered what you brought up and what Lauren is bringing up in chat, which the problem of organizing faculty is a major problem when it comes to university organizing, partly because of faculty having what I like to call an occupational liberalism, which means that even if they are radical in their political imagination, they have been trained in liberal institutions and they have a conception of individual autonomy that has to be protected at all time. That is the idea of liberalism. They disidentify as bosses, even as they do the work of bosses. They disidentify as bosses as if identification itself was how you manage not to be a boss. And so there's a lot of really difficult questions that come with strategies in how to organize faculty. And I think one of the questions for faculty, and I'll send this out for faculty who are listening, is how to make yourself organizable. Because it shouldn't just be incumbent on graduate students to be your moral compass. It's a question of how you actually make yourself, how you push against those reflexes of occupational liberalism in order to figure out how to organize in step with other movements. And that's a long and difficult project. But there's a reason why we don't have faculty unionism in the UC system. And the reflexes, the anti-solidaristic reflexes go a long way to help explain that. So thank you all for this first round of responses. We've got a couple of questions that are being raised in chat, but I wanted to actually just open it up real quick to see if you all had any questions for each other, or points that you wanted to follow up on.
Yeah, so I had a question for Damien. And I was just wondering if you could speak more to the tension between needing concrete asks, right? Concrete steps of action, and what gets talked about by like Harney and Moten, right, as like the need to move without a plan, right? The sort of way that we sometimes need to accept that we're not going to have all of the answers before we take action. And I feel like that's a tension in some of what you were talking about. And I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thanks so much, Blue. Part of it is not so much as having the answers for like what's to be done. All right, so that we abolish policing on campuses. So what happens next? Like I'm all for against having to answer that question. It was more purely from two perspectives. One is a modality for strategy, for organizing building. And this is from a lot of work that I've seen been done through the Southern California Library, so that when organizations come and meet and they plan and they map out what's going to happen, when people in the neighborhood plan and meet what's sort of like the next steps, there's already an understanding that these structures don't work. So that doesn't even have to be explicitly stated. Like that's sort of like a given. And in response, they already have demands for what they want from sort of like its replacement. That's more of what I'm sort of like pushing for, is an incorporation for what's already being demanded by different organizational collectives. Oftentimes, to your point about Moten and Harney, aren't named because they're not legible to the state at all, right? So they're not going to be some sort of organization that you may have heard of before. It's not going to be like a nonprofit, but they're all over the country, and their demands oftentimes are locally driven, they're regionally driven, and it then it becomes incumbent upon us when we are making these articulations about sort of the removal of the police to take into account what those particular demands from these particular regions and locations already are. They're already built in to sort of have in conjunction with saying, in addition to having this happen, this is what we need to have happen, because it's already being driven sort of from the collective. It's one of the things that unfortunately I think was a big miss from what happened in Ferguson, which was that much of the locally driven politics got removed from the conversation as Black Lives Matter becomes sort of like a national phenomenon, and people forget like those things are not going away at all. Those issues are still there in St. Louis County. Those issues are still happening. People are still being murdered as a result of these, as of raising these concerns. And so I think it's very, very vital to keep these two things in conversation with each other.
Excellent. Any other questions you have for each other? I wanted to maybe bring in Lauren's question, which is how do you bring abolitionist ideas into your teaching practices and pedagogy? And as we seek to practice abolition in whatever spaces we have power, what, for example, does a non-punitive syllabus look like? I would also love to hear about how you think about teaching tactically. Meaning because I think there is a almost reflex imagination that our work in universities is to our work as leftists in universities is to do political education, and that's where our transformative work starts. But I also would love to hear both about the practice, but what you think education does, practically speaking, and maybe even what you think it doesn't do, because I think sometimes it becomes the horizon of the tactical imagination. Yulia is saying it all, for them it always comes back to strike, but in some ways, striking is a form of pedagogy about how you relate to power, but it's not necessarily going to show up on a syllabus. Although I did see someone mentioning on Twitter the other day about bringing collective bargaining with students into a classroom practice in the beginning of the quarter. So that's a different question. So yeah, thoughts about both abolitionist pedagogy and also how teaching fits into abolitionist struggle tactically.
I think, hi everybody. I'll jump in here just because I have to jump off a little bit pretty quickly, but I love this question, and I hope to be able to stay on to hear other people's responses, because I have not yet, I hate to say this and share it out loud, but I have not yet had to enter the fray of online teaching. But I will have to do that in January because I've been on research leave. But it concerns me because a lot of what I do practice in the classroom obviously is built around relationship building with my students and encouraging those relations with each other outside of ourselves as teacher students, and consuming knowledge in this really kind of, a Freirean kind of what he talks about in terms of a banking model, and more in terms of building a collectivity. And I don't know how I'm going to do that online, and how this sort of flattens and shapes how we interact with each other is something I think we'll all be thinking about for quite a long time. So I'll just, share one thing, and there's all kinds of responses to this, but one thing that I started not too long ago in a course on Black and Indigenous liberation was a practice of collective reading in a really, in a way that, if any of us have experience with it, it's usually in our elementary school or grammar school days. But it's really that practice of in small groups, reading out loud to each other and slowly and sentence by sentence, and students jumping in. And at the beginning, we all, and I don't think I even anticipated how we would experience it as sort of transformative, because we all thought, oh, we've done this before. We've read together before. We read out loud and we go one by one in class, and you take a sentence. But it was different than that. It was really kind of engaging a text in a way and adding in, our own experiences, but also really trying to get inside the body and thoughts and mind of the scholar that we were engaging, and thinking alongside, we really tried to think alongside that person and build our relationship with the words. And students reported as they, it was a practice that we all struggled with, because they just wanted to kind of resort to other kinds of, strategies and techniques that they built in school, where a lot of it is around performative, or showing what as opposed to our struggle with knowledge and struggle for meaning. And so that's just one small way in which I've worked to build a classroom as a different kind of collective. And I think there's a million ways to do that. I just wanted to share that one story. But again, looking forward to how other folks think about this question, particularly as we're in these like really odd spaces. And prior to the pandemic, or as a pandemic hit, it was often like you met your students and then you had to move online. And now we're facing circumstances in which you don't know your students at all, and your only interaction with them is in these online spaces. And I think it's super challenging.
Is it okay if I go next? Okay. So one of the things that I also think I have found is that I have been doing online teaching since spring quarter, but I've seen my students out at actions. So I think there is this overlap in which, at least to me, by bringing in and naming organizing as another pedagogical tool, and by saying like, yes, here are places and areas where we can break down the walls between the university and the sort of outlying area, I think is really important. So like naming that I'm telling students I may not be able to teach on a certain day because I'm going to an action where I might be arrested, right? Naming or like holding that the violence involved in combating sort of the state is part and parcel of our classroom is also equally important. And I know not everyone does sort of direct action and organizing work, because diversity of tactics is important, but I do think naming and holding that our physical bodies are also important, and they're experiencing various kinds of trauma is also important to really grounding the often far too abstract conversations about liberation that we have in our classrooms. So like naming that I was like shot with a rubber bullet also meant that my students took more seriously the materials we were talking about when we were talking about collective action and state violence, right? And I think that establishing a bodily connection and also the recognition that we are out there and that they can look for me at actions in Sacramento was also important to avoiding the idea that our conversation is just limited to our online space, or even just or limited to UC Davis, right? When Stephon Clark was killed, a big issue was that students felt very disconnected from what was happening in Sacramento. And a lot of our students who were from the area felt like really ostracized. So building in and talking about how we are connected to these communities and we're a part of them also means that folks are less likely to rely on exceptionalism, right? You're not special because you are a college student. In fact, the same police who killed Stephon Clark are the same people who are patrolling the streets on which you live, right? And really making those visceral connections, I think, is really important for us as pedagogical leaders.
Thanks, Blue. Okay, so we've got a couple questions in Q&A. One, thank you, Sandy. Thank you so much. One is a question about making faculty organizable, and I would actually love to hear from Blue and Yulia about questions about how it would be, what it would be like to have faculty who responded solidaristically. Like what would it look like from your perspectives, from the work that you've done, like high level organizing work, to have faculty show up solidaristically?
Yulia, do you want to go first with that one?
Yeah, so one thing that was, I'm gonna say hurtful, is that a lot of faculty who teach and write about liberation and revolution and abolition and decolonization go and cross the picket line. And continue teaching like nothing's the matter. And so, like, a part of the heartbreak and the disappointment was that I actually cannot trust what these people are writing anymore. I can't trust what they're saying in their classrooms. And I think what Blue was saying in terms of like, we practice our pedagogy and articulating how we do it in the street or in organizing or in various spaces outside of the classroom is really important. And so, yeah, I think having faculty show up in the way they do would really bring about the relations that I want to see in organizing and that like I'm organizing for. So I don't know, it created so much distrust, I think. That, and you know, I know like many like dissertation committees were torn apart by that, and yeah, so I'm not certain like how to move forward and organize together like as students and faculty, rather than, you know, a bunch of individuals who are in solidarity with different struggles. Yeah, so it's definitely still a question.
Yeah, just to build off that, I just want to reiterate like the issue of trust. And so one of the questions about being organizable is building relationships of trust in which you can be expected to show up in important ways, both for students and for workers more generally. I was actually just thinking as Yulia was talking, I was like, have I ever seen a member of my faculty out at a city council meeting? Or like, have I ever seen them on the picket line? Have I ever seen them like in these spaces where solidarity and like trust can be built, good faith can be built? And not really, right? Like by and large, even the people who often write and talk about liberation aren't out there, I guess, like visibly making those connections with other folks. And so it's hard to feel like we have a shared sense of class interest or a shared interest in liberation if in fact we're living very different lives and we seem to have different stakes. Just to like name an experience I once had with an advisor who was upset that I wasn't working as much on a project that they wanted me to work on. And they were like, hey, if you could just do less BLM organizing. And there was just this big disconnect between myself and this person who had done lots of work on intersectional liberation stuff, who I was like, well, I can't do this work if I'm like dead in the street. So my materiality and my research aren't separate. And that seems to be something that, at least as a graduate student organizer, is a big barrier to organizing with faculty. I also know something in my own department was that it seemed to blow people's mind when I said, hey, you have all these specialized research skills, you should be teaching them to the community. And you should be helping folks to do the organizing that they need to do. Pick a topic, right? I'm not asking you to do it on one particular thing, but use the skills that you have to actually, what's the word? To funnel resources, including intellectual capital, into the communities that you ostensibly support. Don't keep the tools that you know how to use in your own like mind, in your own sphere. And that's actually, I just wanted to say, like, Audrey, that work on developing a toolkit seems really important because there is this breakdown. I know working with organizations here in Sacramento, folks are like, what is an information request, right? You've got people who have who are grounded in the community, who are doing important work, who I think, as Damien, you pointed out, right, are folks who have explicit demands, who could use the resources, both intellectual and social, that faculty have. And I don't see faculty as interested in giving up those things that have marked them as special and different. And I guess that's my thing, is that we can talk about abolition in the broad sense, but how are we abolishing our own privileges here in the academy? And I don't see people, particularly faculty, engaging in good faith with folks who are more marginalized. I also gotta say, I don't have all the answers. To be perfectly honest, I have found faculty not very helpful, and I don't do very much work with faculty, in particular because of a lot of these barriers. In fact, one of my first issues with the Cops Off Campus Coalition was that often it was focused on faculty, and it sort of framed faculty as like the leaders and sponsors. That I was like, hey, like all these other people on the ground have been doing this work for a hella long time. Welcome to the conversation, right? And so one of the other things I think that they can do is be quiet. Like not be quiet in that you don't do anything, but be quiet in that you don't take up organizing space. You utilize your resources to support the people who have already created the demands, have already articulated their needs.
This is Andrew, the interpreter. I just want to pop in and mention that Carly is not spotlighted. And so that was a really awesome point, but I don't know that it was accessible in the last 30 seconds or so. She's on now. Thank you.
I have, this is Audrey. I have a few ideas sort of riffing off of what Yulia and Blue just mentioned. I've also tried to organize with faculty members and form a graduate union. My grad school was very, our grad school had a union busting lawyer on retainer. And so obviously this was very difficult, but we found that in working with faculty, tenure track faculty were certainly less willing to sort of go against the whims of the university, but we found, speaking with contingent faculty members like adjuncts or other contract faculty, or some junior tenure track faculty comrades were a lot more willing to engage with us and a lot more willing to support the work that we were doing. I think we need to contend with the sort of the perceived class solidarity that faculty members have with the administration, and be willing to sort of decenter those relationships. But I think that working with contingent faculty members, and I think grad student workers are a really big part of this. I think making that small bridge from grad worker, especially TAs, to other contingent faculty members can do a lot. I mean, it's kind of like planting a mole, right? Like you go in and then you salt around in the contingent body, and you hope that they can sort of spread the good word, I suppose, like that. We found that was making some headway. This is something that we at Rensselaer had been working on for literally years and hadn't gotten a ton of traction on. But right as the pandemic was really spinning up, we found a lot of solidarity with adjuncts who were suddenly faced with losing everything.
Okay, so I guess we probably have time for one more question. I'll just add, as a faculty member, tactically, one thing that I think was useful for me was in a way doing what Blue was recommending, was show up and shut up. Like, and like I think that was important to me because, like, I just sort of an object permanence thing, so that folks would know that I was gonna be there, and folks knew that I was gonna be there and try not to be taking up all the space, and that I could be called on to do stuff, but I just kind of be part of the social world, trying to hold it down and make sure there was a sense that faculty were going to show up, just on a consistent basis. And I think that was kind of one thing that I thought I could provide, was some baseline of consistent presence, and that could help create continuity between conversations. I certainly wasn't the only faculty member to do that, but like I think that was one thing that I learned in the course of being in a struggle that was playing out in large part on a picket line. And so, yeah, that, and the other thing just being, your critique isn't needed all the time. Like you may kind of identify with your capacity for criticism, but sometimes showing up really does mean like being part of a larger being that does not privilege your voice, and the insistence that your voice be privileged in the operations of everything can actually be one of the ways in which critical reflexes turn into practical counterinsurgency. And so, the kind of belief in critique first, and if it doesn't have my critical voice in it, then it can't possibly be good, is a kind of underlying ideology that for some faculty members was very clear in the way that they engaged in the context of struggle. So I wanted to end and thank you all for these fantastic questions. But I wanted to end with the question of how do you protect Black and Indigenous student organizer activists? In the classroom, the street level actions, trauma and lethal engagement with the state, combined with the fear of negating academic success by being labeled as an activist, organizer, abolitionist, has been preventative for myself and many other UC BIPOC students. How can you ensure our involvement is protected? I think I can probably start out just by saying we can't ensure, but we can work. Yeah, other thoughts?
I mean, one thing I would say is I have seen white people literally put their bodies between the police and bodies of organizers or students or people of color. And on the picket line, I have seen faculty do that. is a way in which, by recognizing our different privileges in a situation, in like a standoff with the state, that if we are working together, there is a way to organize ourselves to try to protect each other and protect people who are consistently harmed by the state in ways that white people are not. Yeah, but I think what Nick said, like, I don't think we can guarantee that. Yeah, but I don't know if we can like stop trying to organize.
So one potential way of doing that, we're just looking at sort of the insurgent Black Studies movements, Black Studies programs that formed, is in terms of having community partnerships, like real solid community partnerships that develop outside of the university, so that when we're talking about that, these movements can't be just located primarily through the issues and causes of what happens on the university grounds. So they have to be tied to the political economy of what's going on immediately, in that area. And in that way, then what forms is less of sort of individual actors that can easily be picked off by the university or by the state, and more you have a larger formation that is sort of willing and readily there to support any type of action. And it's a reciprocal dynamic. It's not just sort of these groups helping people on the university, but it goes both ways. So I'll just throw that out there, that we, just not to forget about that these movements have occurred in the past, and there are potential solutions that we can use from the success that happened in the past as a way to move forward as well.
So I really think that this is an important question. And yeah, I want to reiterate what Nick said, which is just that, like, there is no ensuring safety. And I want to push it a little bit further and just say that participating or not participating in these actions still does not ensure safety. And so it's not, at least to me, one of the questions is not how do we make the action safe, but how is it that we make ourselves safer in multiple contexts, right? And I think that it's really important to take into account that also, those of us who are lucky enough to be on these campuses in these circles also have various forms of privileges that we need to contend with and be real about. And so again, building that, I think, as Damien pointed out, right, like building the community connection is really important to understanding our own privileges and positions, and how we have a responsibility to the BIPOC folks who are not and have been denied access to the spaces that we are in. And so instead of thinking about how we can continue to like reproduce ourselves and reproduce our sort of upward trajectory and avoid trauma, we should instead be thinking about how we heal trauma collectively as we go through the work. What does it look like? I think this would be where we could talk about relationality, right? As Sandy was bringing up, how important relationality is to continuing the work, because instead of thinking of it as avoiding trauma, it's about how we can actually continue to heal as this fight continues. And I think that it's really, really important to talk about showing up in the community and having the community show up for you. So that instead of thinking about as individual risk management, right, which is often how sometimes we are socialized into thinking about this, like, can I take this risk? Thinking about it in terms of the community as a whole. Yeah, I want to reiterate that avoiding trauma isn't an option. The question is about what we do with that, and how we position that trauma in relationship to the struggle as a whole.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you all for participating. Thank you so much to our interpreters for holding it down the whole time. Thank you especially to Sung Kim and to Jess Haney from Critical Resistance for an incredible amount of work on making all 3 of these webinars happen. Thank you so much. And thank you all for participating. Give us a shout on Twitter. Sign up and get involved with the COPS Off Campus Research Project. The database is there. We want to support you in doing the research. And yeah, keep on in the struggle.